All right, so last week we began our what's going to be a 2-week trek on what it means to be made in the image of God. Last week we talked through the uses of the word image in the Old Testament and discussed how they might be related to helping us understand what it means to be in the image of God. So we saw important points on how being in God's image means that God is relatable, God is understandable, how we can even learn about God's characteristics from others because we've been made in God's image. The image of God also relates to the value of each person and the sanctity of human life. But now this brings us to what theologically is the controversial question when it comes to the image of God, and that is, what is God's image in us? Is being in God's image mean that we have morality? Does it mean that we have the ability to reason and think? Is the image of God the role that we possess in creation? And I want to note that this will always be a controversial question because there's no singular passage in the Bible that says this is what it means to be made in the image of God. So whatever anybody says to answer that question, what we're doing is we're taking the totality of what the Bible says about being made in God's image, and we're using that to answer a question that the Bible doesn't specifically answer. So we're a little bit on theory on this. So we need to remember that my view on this could be wrong. Your view, if it's different than mine, could be right. But we don't know for sure. So on this topic, we need to understand that we're discussing what we see in the Bible, and it's something that we don't have a hard and fast answer for. I think this only becomes problematic to talk about this when we begin to say, well, then my view is absolutely right, and your view is absolutely wrong. My view is scriptural, and your view isn't. We're just trying to do our best to take together what it is that the scriptures have for us. So what I'm going to bring about in this topic is basically the four probably most common views on what it means to be made in God's image. A lot of this comes from the book Humanity by John Hammett and Katie McCoy. So the first theory on what it means to be made in the image of God is that it means that we resemble or have characteristics of God. So being made in God's image means that humans have some quality or qualities that have resemblance and are relatable to God. So this is the idea that being made in God's image means that we are rational, we're creative. For some people, it could be that we do righteous works. We act in the way that God would desire to act. We're discerning, or we're like God because we have language and reason. We have intelligent and emotion. That primarily these are the characteristics that separate us from animals. This view has strength in the fact that this does line up a lot with the idea of how image is used in the Old Testament. It corresponds well to the fact that we are the image of God in comparison to idols being the image of false gods. But it also has two shortcomings. One shortcoming is that not every person possesses these characteristics or resemblances of God that are brought out. So the question would be like, does a baby not have the image of God until it develops these characteristics? For instance, J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien said that the image of God is creativity. Now, he doesn't limit that to the writings of the worlds of myths like he did, but he says anytime anyone does something creative, they create in any way, they are in the image of God. And I think this is actually pretty defensible. Like, he builds this based upon Genesis, because what is the first thing that we know about God? He is the creator. And since we are in God's image, every time we are creating, we are being like God. But then the problem with that is, are more creative people more in God's image than less creative people are? Can a baby in the womb be considered part of God's image because it cannot create? What if someone comes in a coma? Once you get into a coma, are you then no longer part of God's image because you cannot create? The other shortcoming with this whole view of the resemblance and characteristics is that you look at a lot of them and you're like, animals can do some of these things. Like, for instance, animals can create. For example, the pufferfish will create this amazing work of art that's 6 feet in diameter. And the reason that the pufferfish creates this work of art in the bottom of the ocean is in order to attract a mate. So the more unique the art is that the pufferfish creates in the ocean, the more likely it is that a female pufferfish will come and swim into the midst of that. And then they will spawn a new baby pufferfish in there. So pufferfish have the ability to create, to make these works of art. It's kind of cool what pufferfish can able to do. In fact, it says in there that it takes the pufferfish a week of continual work in order to make that one work of art, because as soon as it stops doing that, the waters just, blow it away within a couple of hours. So it'll work continuously to keep it into that form. So while we do resemble God and we hold God's characteristic, to see this as the image of God can have a tendency to limit God's image to people who can hold certain characteristics. And then it also bleeds into the fact that, well, then maybe animals are in some way made in the image of God, which according to the Bible obviously is not true. It is only us as human beings. The second option for the image of God, it is what is known as the functional or representational view. This is the view that being made in God's image means that we are God's representatives on earth. We are in God's image as we rule over creation. As creation is subject to us, so we are in God's image. The biggest support for having this be the image of God in it is its proximity of God's command to rule, with it being stated in Genesis that we are also made in God's image. So we've looked a couple of weeks in a row in Genesis 1, 26 and 27 about how we are made in the image of God. It says it 3 times in those 2 verses. Well, immediately following those 2 verses on being made in God's image, in Genesis 1, 28, we read the following. God blessed them, that is, those made in his image. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So the logic is what we're seeing in Genesis 1, 26, 27, and 28 is that we are in God's image because we are to rule over the earth. Why are we supposed to be fruitful and multiply? Because God wants to spread his image bearers all over the world so that all of the world is being ruled over those who are made in God's image. I think this view has a lot of strengths to it. First and foremost, because it's clearly tied to our creation in God's image in Genesis chapter 1, and the functional use of ruler fits well with the idea of image in the way that we see it throughout the Old Testament. But I think the problem with this is the same problem we have with the characteristics view, which is someone who is not in some way actively involved in ruling or governing over the world still in God's image? So would you say that an infant who can't do anything other than cry and eat and soil their diapers and look really cute and adorable, is that person still in God's image even though they are not in any way governing over the world? The same with someone who is elderly at the end of their life. Are they to a point where they are also no longer in God's image? Now, the obvious objection to that is to say, well, each person is meant to rule, even if they're not functionally able to do that at that point, even if they can't exercise it. The infant who is in her mother's womb, she's intended to grow into that person who is having the world subject under her. And so you would say that she is meant to be God's representative on earth. So it is God. So God, as as the ruler, the Lord of the world, has made us to rule over it in his stead and in his image. So God is personally the governor of this world and has us in his stead in this world. And also, I think this ties into the very nature of creation. In Romans chapter 8, verses 20 to 22, we read, "For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now." So why does creation groan? Creation groans because it is waiting for the freedom that creation will receive when the children of God act in the glory and the image of God that they're created to. So we as human beings, according to Paul in Romans chapter 8, we are causing creation to groan. And the reason that humans are causing creation to groan roots back to Adam and Eve in the garden. When Adam and Eve sinned, they subjected creation to futility. And so creation is now waiting for the curse to be reversed, for everything to live and be restored as God intended it to. So we're intended to rule over the world as the rulers in the stead of God. We're not doing a very good job of it. But if we do it, it will be the glory to the creation. So I think this is a strong view. This is probably, I think today it could maybe in conservative views, this could be the most common look at what it means to be made in God's image, in the fact that we are to rule over the world in the stead of God and to obey the command of Genesis chapter 1:28. So I think this has a really strong case for being what it means to be made in God's image. The third view of being made in God's image is probably the one that's been growing in popularity the most among theologians over the last 100 years. And this is called the relational view of the image of God. And that is, being made in God's image is not about our characteristics we possess. It's not about the functions that we have. But being made in God's image means that we were created to be in fellowship with God. We're created to be in relationship with God. So animals can't be in relationship to God as we can be. And so being made in God's image means that we are to be in friendship with God. This view became, really popular mid-20th century because it had two pretty well-known guys who were advocating for it regularly, and that were Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Were both sort of proclaiming this as the image of God. Barth believed that we see this initially in Genesis 1:26 when we read, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image.'" And he said the purpose of the plurals of us and our were God indicating that these newly created beings, unlike the birds and the mice, these people were created to be in communion and fellowship and interaction with God. So God created the birds, not because God's like, I want to go out there and have conversations with the birds and fellowship with the birds, but he's saying specifically that's why God created us, so that he could be in relationship with us. Regarding those who take this view, I would say that this is as simple as saying that the reason that God created man was because God wanted friendship with mankind. Like that's what he wanted. He created Adam so that Adam could be his friend. And then this would mean that the purpose of every single person in this world, every person on earth, God desires to be in friendship with them. That is the desire that God has for every person in making them in his image, which then in turn leads to a secondary application, and that is we are not only meant to be friends of God because we were created in his image, but we are also made to be in friendship and fellowship with everyone else. We should look at every person on earth and say, I'm supposed to be in fellowship with that person because they were made in God's image and I was made in God's image, and God's image is all about friendship and fellowship. I think this view actually, when I ended up looking at it a little bit more, I think has a lot more to speak in its favor than I expected it to, because I don't like Karl Barth, and I'm not a big fan of a lot of the stuff that Dietrich Bonhoeffer did. So I kind of wanted to dismiss this view immediately, but I think it actually has a lot to go for it. One thing that I think that speaks for it is that out of the four sort of major options of what it means to be made in the image of God, I think this is the view that most clearly ties to Calvary and the gospel. And that is, why did Jesus die on the cross for sinners like us? Because God doesn't want people to be sinners and to go to hell. Like, that's not his goal for every person. What is his goal for every person? He wants them all to believe in the gospel and come into fellowship with him. So the very understanding that we're made in the image of God should allow us to look at every person and say, that person is made in God's image. God wants to be in relationship and fellowship with them, so I should share the gospel with them. So I think that has one strong positive to it. Also, it relates to the idea of understanding what it means to be spiritually dead. What does it mean that someone is spiritually dead? It means that they are separated from God. It means that their friendship, their relationship with God has been severed. It doesn't mean that they're incapable of understanding the gospel. It doesn't mean that they can't do anything right. It doesn't mean that they can't comprehend truth, but it means that they're intended to have a friendship and relationship with God, but that friendship is severed. It's been broken, and it needs to be brought back together. And how can it be brought back together but through faith in Jesus Christ? So when God said in Genesis 2:17, "But from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." So the question is, did Adam die when he ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? He didn't die. He continued to live for hundreds of years. Adam lived longer than any of us in this world will live if Christ restrains and doesn't come back in our lifetime. So Adam continued to live. But how did he actually die when he ate from that tree? His relationship, his friendship, his fellowship with God was severed. That was what was killed. So here's the negative. And the negative, I think, is actually probably maybe the biggest possible negative of it. And it could have a really deep, dark side to it. And that is, the Christian could drift into a viewpoint of, well, I believe in Jesus, so my friendship with God has been restored. So that means I am in God's image. But the unbeliever who is separated from God, they are not in God's image. So it's a way to say, I'm a full person, I'm in God's image, but someone who hasn't believed in Jesus is not. But one thing we discussed last week is that the image of God wasn't lost as a result of the fall. So unbelievers, those out of relationship with God, are still in the image of God. So we just need to state clearly, if you were to follow this view on what is God's image, is that it is our capacity for relationship with God that makes us in God's image, and not someone's actual willingness to have placed their faith in Jesus Christ. And I do think the strong part for this is that for taking this as what it means for God's image is that this should be a motivation to share the gospel with other people. Because if we hold fellowship and relationship as what it means to be made in the image of God, this should allow us to look at every person and say that no one was born doomed for hell from the womb to the tomb. But every person was created to be in friendship with God. And also, it should be another encourager that when someone comes to believe in the gospel, if you hold this view, when someone believes that Jesus died on the cross for their sins, rose from the dead, something supernatural is not occurring. Because in fact, what is occurring if someone believes in the gospel is they are doing what should be the most natural thing in the world. I think the devil wants us to think, oh man, they're never going to believe, because that's an extreme thing, and the chances of them believing it, man, that is so small. So he wants us to get really nervous and be like, man, I probably shouldn't share my faith, because they're probably not going to believe it anyways, because they're too hardened or too ignorant or too immersed in their sins or another religion. When the reality is that every dead sinner who is currently separated from God, they were actually created to be in relationship with God. They were created to be in friendship with God. That's why Jesus came and died for them and rose from the dead, because he is offering them the life that they don't have, but they were created to have. They should have that life, but they don't because of their sin. So the relational view comes and says that person that is apart from God, they were made to be in God. So you're actually telling them, here is the life you were made for. Here is the friendship that you were made for. Believe in Jesus Christ, and you can have the fullness of what you were intended to have. So I think that that's a big benefit of this view, is the fact that it should be a spurring us on to say, share the gospel with those people, because the whole point of that gospel is for that unbeliever to believe. And that's the whole, that's what we're going for here. So I think that would be a good positive of this view. So there are the three views out of what I consider to be the four, I guess, orthodox, like possibly biblical views of what it means to be made in the image of God. The final view is the view that I hold to, and it is the view that is called the composite, the blended, or the multifaceted view on the image of God. And this one needs a little bit of explaining, because the majority who hold to it don't take it quite the way that I do. So the composite view is the view that the image of God in us is the totality of who we are as a person. That's why it's composite or blending, that is taking all these various characteristics and roles that we're supposed to have in fellowship and putting them all together. So it's where we're saying that having the image of God in us is not about specific characteristics that we have. It's not primarily about the role that we're supposed to have. It's not primarily about the fellowship and relationship that we have to have with God, but it is the entirety of who we are. So the other key to the component of this view is that it is founded on understanding also that the image of God is not only fully in who we are now, but it also points to who we are meant to be. And that is, God desires us to be fully in his image, as in the image of Jesus Christ. For instance, I believe, in line with Tolkien, that creativity is a sign that we are made in God's image, but obviously some people are very creative. Other people will be like, I'm not creative at all. My idea of, creativity with colors is different shades of gray. But regardless of how creative or uncreative you are, the multifaceted view comes and says, even if you are not everything you need to be right now, God still desires you to be that. So this also provides what I'd call an eschatological or end times focus on the image of God in man. And that is, while we are all God's image right now, you would never say one person is any less in the image of God than somebody else. We also will say we're not going to fully understand what it is to be the image of God until we're all living in our resurrected bodies and we see Jesus Christ face to face. So I can look at an infant in ultrasound images in its mother's womb and say, he can't sing praises, he can't walk a dog, he can't give compassion to other people. This infant does nothing but receive nutrients and grow, but he is no less part of God's image, someone who is made in God's image, because God's intention for that baby in the womb is to mature and grow and develop and believe the gospel and come into relationship with Jesus Christ and be a good steward of creation and live with God characteristics in this world. So from the first moment of conception throughout his entire life, he is never any less than the image of God, because the image of God is the fullness, the totality of who that person is. But I say this one needs a little more explaining, because there's two subcategories for this view. One of them is what I would call the Neo-Calvinist view. This is the view brought about by Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck. And the Neo-Calvinist view says the same thing, that there's no single part of human that makes them the image of God. It's the totality of who they are. But they talk about the composite view, and they have what I would call an extreme dualistic view of God's image in us, where they would write that we have the image of God, it's the totality of who we are, but that image is severely damaged in light of the fall. So they take basically that there's two aspects to the image of God, and one where it is damaged and needs to be restored, and yet even that damaged is still the image, even though it has been defaced, and man is not truly the image of God until he is born again, and then he won't truly be it until he reaches final glorification. And I differ on that, as I said last week, talking about the image of God. I don't believe there's a dualistic view for God's image in the fact that one person's image of God in them has been defaced or deformed or damaged. Because I said last time, there's no actual verse in the Bible that talks about the image of God in us being defaced or devalued or deformed. That's something that's theologically inserted into the text and something that we don't actually see in the Bible. So even though we're not fully walking according to God's characteristics, we're not living with the compassion and the grace and the mercy that we're intended to have. Obviously, we're not all believers in Jesus Christ. At the same time, we still fully have God's image in us. And why I take this view is because I believe this view is best expressed in the basic idea that when we understand what is God's image in us, we understand that in the same equivalent of Seth having Adam's image in him. So we're looking at God's image in us being the same way as the image of a child to their parent. And the reason I say that is because we have image and likeness both being used in Genesis chapter 1. And then the one other passage we have both image and likeness being used is in Genesis chapter 5, when it talks about Seth being in the image and likeness of his father, Adam. So in the same way that a son or daughter is in the image of their parents, so too every person is in the image of God. And when it comes to a child and being in the image of their parents, I think we would all readily admit that there is a composite or multifaceted way in which a child is a representative of their parents. A child will in some way look exactly like their parents, but there's other kids where you got to squint real hard to see that that child is in the image of their parents, but it's still there. For example, my older brother, Scott, who's 3 years older than me, he has blonde hair, but his blonde hair is like, it's always been like bleach blonde hair. Like you would think he dyes it. It is so close to being white. Like it is just as blonde as it can be. And he still has that same blonde hair at the age of 43. But he married a woman, a lovely young lady by the name of Michelle. And his wife, Michelle, has what I would say dirty blonde hair. And so their first two kids came out and they both had this sort of mixture of Scott's hair and Michelle's hair of, various shades of blonde all in their hair. And then their third daughter came out, Kylie. And she is like the definition of the redheaded stepchild because she comes out and she has, like from birth, she has red hair, like the reddest hair. And it is like, where in the world did that red hair come from with my brother's blonde hair and Michelle's dirty blonde hair that she has? And then funny thing happens, probably about 10 years ago, my brother grows out his beard for the first time. And when my brother grows out his beard hair is the same color as his daughter's hair that she has on her head. Like my brother, when he grows a beard, it is the funniest thing because he has bleach blonde hair on his head and then his face is this bright red hair, which is his daughter's hair. So when when Scott first grew his hair out and he had this beard and then Kylie's there, I'm like, Kylie, you got your dad's beard. So like she's in her dad's image, but it's just kind of interesting how it passes on from person to person. So no child is their parents' image in a singular specific way. Some children take up their parents' occupation. and do the same exact job as their parents, and they love it, and they're both great at it. Other children look exactly like their parents, some of them not quite so much. It's this interesting mixture. And I believe that's how we should see the image of God in us. It's not picking any of these one specific things and saying it's the characteristics that we have, or it's the role that we have to rule, or it's the fact that we're to be in a relationship to God. It is all of those things brought together, making us in the image of God. And what I like about this view is that for me, when you take this blended totality view, it means that every single person from the moment of their conception, no matter how creative they are or how good they are at stewarding things or what they might necessarily look like in the characteristics that they have, we are all part of God's image. Again, another illustration of this, it's sort of comical how little I look like my father. My terrible posture and my small feet are about all that I have from my dad in my appearance. Instead, my appearance is exactly like my mom's dad. Like I am like the spitting image of my grandfather, except for one thing. When my grandfather passed away in his 80s, he had a full head of hair. And I got my uncle's baldness. That's about the only thing I got. Yet I'm still in my dad's image. Even if someone would look at me and they'd say, "Oh, Scott, he looks exactly like your dad. Sean, you don't really look like him hardly at all." I'd still say like I am in my father's image, even if it doesn't look that way to other people. And so I am just going to beat this drum that every person in this world, from the darkest sinner to the most Christ-like Christian, the one thing that we all share is that we are all made in the image of God. And that image of God in us is marked at the moment of conception, and it is never erased or diminished until somebody dies and passes away from this world. And I think that this is the key trait that we need to see from the image of God, that every person holds it. And that's, I think, two reasons for that. One, this is why we should share the gospel with people, because every person is God's image, and we want them all to believe and to be in relationship with the God who created them in their image. But I think the second reason why this is important is that this brings moral significance to our sin. I believe this brings moral significance to our sin. As I mentioned at the start of this series, living on planet Earth, on this planet, we are surrounded by trillions of other creatures, like literally trillions of bugs and mammals and reptiles. All of them have breath in them. All of them reproduce. All of them bond in affection. They can create things of beauty. I mean, animals are works of art of beauty in and of themselves. But there's one thing that we can do that an animal cannot do. And what can we do that an animal can't do? We can sin. Animals cannot sin. Why can they not sin? Because they're not made in the image of God. When a lion kills a man, or if a crocodile gets hold of a wildebeest and pulls it into the water, those are not sin. Those are animals walking according to their nature. Our nature, on the other hand, is the image of God. Our nature is not sin. If our nature was sin, we wouldn't be blameworthy when we sin, because that's all we can do, and we're just like the animals. But since we've been made in the image of God, I believe we can sin or we can not sin. And therefore, it matters when we do sin. So the image of God says it matters when we sin, specifically because we're made in God's image. Therefore, we are blameworthy when we do sin. So before the fall, God warned Adam not to eat from the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. Warns him not to do it. So Adam has the choice. He can eat the fruit or he cannot eat the fruit. And we know, sadly, what did he do? Ate the fruit. After the fall, though, interestingly enough, God gives a similar type of warning to Adam's son, to sin or not to sin. After Cain is all bitter that God didn't like his offering of vegetables, And let's be honest, like if someone's going to come up and give you an offering of a lamb roast or a bunch of roasted vegetables, you're going to pick the lamb roast every single day of the week. But Cain is upset that God did not like his vegetable roast. So this is what the Lord says to Cain in the midst of his anger. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door in its desire for you, but you must master it." So the Lord, even after the fall, comes up to Cain and he gives him the option to do well. And I don't really like that translation, to do well, because that word well that's translated into our English Bibles is the same exact Hebrew word that we find in Genesis chapter 1 for good. It's the word tov. So God comes to Cain and he says, "Cain, you can do tov. You can do good. He can do what is right and not sin." And this is like in the world of options between doing what is the good and the not good, like Cain almost has like the easiest two options in the world. All he has to do is not kill his brother, and he will do what is good. But instead, he does the bad. He kills his brother in jealousy and in anger. And why does Cain have those options to do well or to not do well, to do good, to not do good? The animals don't have that option. Animals cannot decide to do good or not to do good. They can just do what their nature compels them to do. We have that option because, like Adam, like Eve, like Cain, like Abel, like Seth, we have been made in God's image. And this is why our sin matters, because we are people made in the image of God. And we'll talk more about this issue going forward. We'll talk about those passages where it says no one's righteous, no one does good, and we'll talk about how that relates and applies to this. A lot of that will come into how the Bible talks about the blameless and the upright and comparing the two with that. But what I want to start with this foundation of why are our decisions important as people? All of our decisions are important because we're God's representatives on earth. We've been made in the image of God. That's why it matters when every single person sins, because they are supposed to be God's image on earth. They are God's image on earth, and they are despoiling the blessing and the gift that they've been given and living according to their sin. And so the order in which we're doing these, this might seem a little like I'm not continuing this discussion next week, but we're going to get back to this. But I want to continue to walk through Genesis 1 and do things in the order that they come up with the creation of man there. And so after man's created in God's image, the next part is the constitution in which God has made them. And so next week we'll start talking about whether we're body, soul, spirit. That'll be what will come up next week in the order in which stuff comes up in Genesis.